My daughter called me from the airport at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I was already awake. I'm always awake by 6. At 63, sleep becomes a negotiation, and most mornings I lose. I was standing at the kitchen window with my second cup of coffee, watching the neighbors' sprinklers go on, thinking about nothing in particular, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I saw her name and picked up before the second ring. Mom. That was all she said. Just that one word. But I've been her mother for 34 years, and I know every version of how she says that word. This one was the version that meant she was trying very hard not to fall apart. Where are you? I said. Terminal B. Her voice dropped. The parking structure. Level 3. Are you hurt? No. Is Lily with you? A pause. Yes, she's here. Stay there, I said. I was already walking to the bedroom for my keys. Don't move. I'm coming. She started to say something else, something about not wanting to bother me, and I said, Nora, stay where you are. Then I hung up and put on my shoes. I had met my son-in-law, Brandon, exactly 9 years before that morning. Nora brought him to Thanksgiving dinner at my house in Scottsdale, and he arrived with a bottle of wine I recognized as mid-range and a smile I recognized as practiced. He was handsome in the way that requires maintenance. Hair always just so, shirts always pressed, laugh always arriving a half second after everyone else's to make sure it was the right kind of laugh. I didn't dislike him. That's important to say. I watched him carefully over dinner, and I thought, this man is performing, but I've known a lot of people who perform. Sometimes it's just nerves. Sometimes it's how they were raised. I gave him the benefit of the doubt because Nora looked at him the way I hadn't seen her look at anyone, and she is my daughter, and I wanted her to be happy. They got married 2 years later. Small ceremony in Sedona, red rocks in the background. Nora in a dress she'd found at a consignment shop, and altered herself because she said she didn't want to spend $3,000 on something she'd wear once. I liked that about her. She has always been practical in the ways that matter. What she wasn't at 27 was experienced in reading financial documents. That's on me partly. Her father handled our money until he passed, and then I handled it alone, and I never thought to sit Nora down and walk her through leases, through LLCs, through what it means when a business has a named owner versus a silent one. I assumed she would learn as she needed to. I assumed wrong. Brandon's family owned or appeared to own 2 restaurants in the Phoenix metro area. His father, a man named Gerald who wore boat shoes indoors and talked with his hands, had started the first one about 15 years back. Italian-American comfort food. Decent enough. The second location opened 6 years later, and that one was in Tempe, closer to the university crowd. What Nora understood when she married Brandon was that she was marrying into a restaurant family. What she didn't understand was the structure underneath. Gerald had his name on things. His name was on the website, on the signage, at the top of the letterhead. When new vendors came in, Gerald shook their hands and talked about his vision and his legacy. Brandon, over the years, had taken on more and more of the actual operations, managing staff, handling scheduling, dealing with the health inspector when he came around. Nora joined the business 3 years into the marriage. She took over the bookkeeping for both locations because their bookkeeper retired, and it made sense financially for her to step in rather than hire someone new. She was good at it. She's good with numbers, always has been. She caught 2 billing errors in the first month that had been bleeding money for years. What she didn't know, what I didn't know until I started looking, was that Gerald's name on the signage wasn't the same as Gerald's name on the lease. The parking structure at Terminal B is never warm, even in April. The concrete holds the cold from the night before. I found Nora on the 3rd level, sitting on the ground with her back against a support pillar, Lily in her lap. Lily was 18 months old and apparently unbothered, chewing on the strap of Nora's bag and watching the cars pass with the focused interest that toddlers give to everything. I didn't say anything at first. I just sat down next to her on the concrete, which is not easy at 63 with bad knees, and I put my arm around her. She started crying then. The kind of crying that has been held back for a while. I let her cry. I held on and I waited and I watched Lily, who looked up at me with her grandmother's instinct and reached out one small hand and touched my cheek. After a while, Nora pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her hand. "He changed the locks," she said. "I went home after my shift last night and my key didn't work. He didn't answer the door. I could see lights on inside. When did you last speak to him?" "Wednesday. We argued about—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter what we argued about. He texted me Thursday morning and said he needed space." That was the whole text. 3 words. "I need space." She laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. I thought he meant for a few days. I thought he was being dramatic. I've been staying at Kristen's with Lily since Thursday. Kristen is her college roommate. I made a note to send Kristen something when this was over. "And the restaurant?" I said, because I already knew there was more. Nora looked at her hands. "Gerald called me this morning, 5:30 a.m. He said my position was being eliminated. He said it effective immediately and that I should not report for my shift." A pause. "Hey, wish me luck." I looked out at the concrete columns and the grey morning light coming through the open sides of the structure. "He wished you luck," I repeated. "Yes." I thought about that for a moment. "All right," I said. "Let's get Lily into the car. I want to explain something about how I am because people who know me from Sunday dinners and neighborhood block parties might not understand the other side of it. I spent 22 years as a paralegal at a commercial real estate firm in Phoenix. I retired at 61 because my husband had gotten sick and I wanted to be with him, and then he passed 14 months later, and by then retiring felt right anyway. But 22 years means I have read thousands of commercial leases. I know what subordination clauses are. I know what personal guarantee provisions mean. I know what a properly recorded UCC filing looks like and what it means when one isn't there. I also know that people who present themselves as owners of businesses are not always the people whose names appear on the controlling documents. 3 months before Nora's wedding, I had a conversation with Brandon that he probably doesn't remember. It was at a barbecue at Gerald's house, and I asked, genuinely curious, how the restaurant leases were structured. Brandon waved his hand and said his father handled all of that. Gerald, nearby, heard the question and said they'd had the same landlord for 10 years, and it was all very simple. Simple. That word. I smiled and changed the subject. But that evening, when I got home, I did what I always do when something doesn't settle right. I went to the Maricopa County Assessor's website. I looked up the commercial properties where both restaurants operated. Then I checked the recorded lease documents on file with the county. Gerald's name was not the primary lessee on either location. The primary lessee on both leases was an LLC. The registered agent for that LLC, according to the Arizona Corporation Commission database, was a woman named, and I'm protecting her privacy by not using her real name here, someone who had been Gerald's business partner in the early years and had never formally exited the arrangement. The leases had been assigned to this entity before Gerald's name ever appeared in any marketing material. I sat with that information for a while. Then I made a call to a colleague I'd kept in touch with, a real estate attorney named Helen, who had done title work for our firm for years. I described the situation hypothetically. Helen described hypothetically what kinds of leverage a party in my position might have if a family dispute ever emerged around those business assets. Then I filed that information away. In my actual files, printed in a manila folder in my home office. That folder had been sitting in my filing cabinet for 9 years. Lily fell asleep in the car seat before we cleared the airport exit. Nora sat in the passenger seat with her head against the window, not talking, watching the desert scroll past. I didn't fill the silence. Some silences need to be filled and some don't, and I've learned over 63 years to tell the difference. When we pulled into my driveway, I got Lily settled on the guest bed with the travel pillow Nora always brought, and I went to the kitchen and made toast and eggs because neither of them had eaten. Nora came and sat at the kitchen island and watched me cook. "What are we going to do?" she said finally. I put a plate in front of her. "Eat first." She almost smiled. "Mom, eat. Then we'll talk." She ate. She was hungry. You can always tell. When the plate was mostly clear, I went to my home office and came back with the manila folder. I set it on the counter between us. She looked at it. "What is this? Open it." She opened it. She looked at the first document, then the second, then looked up at me. "How long have you had this? Since before your wedding?" She stared at me. I could see her processing it, working backward, trying to understand. "You knew," she said. "This whole time. I knew the structure. I didn't know what they would do with it." I sat down across from her. "I hoped I'd never need to use it, but I kept the information because I don't believe in being unprepared." She looked down at the papers again. I watched her reading, really reading, the way she does when something matters, her finger tracing the lines, her lips moving slightly. "So Gerald," she said slowly, "he is a named manager on the LLC operating agreement, yes, but the LLC itself, the entity that holds the lease, has a second member whose interest was never properly bought out. That woman, whoever she is, has standing." I paused. "And there's something else." She waited. "When you came on as bookkeeper, you signed an employment agreement with the LLC, not with Gerald personally. Not with Brandon, the LLC, which means Gerald, acting alone, cannot terminate your employment without a vote of the managing members." I tapped the folder. "He doesn't have the votes." Nora was quiet for a long moment. "He doesn't know that." "No," I said, "he doesn't." I called Helen that afternoon. She had done a few things in the 9 years since our last conversation, made partner, gotten a better office, developed a specialty in exactly this kind of business dispute. She picked up on the second ring and listened while I explained the situation, not hypothetically this time. When I finished, there was a brief silence. "When can you come in?" she said. What followed was not dramatic in the way movies make things dramatic. There was no confrontation in a restaurant dining room. There was no moment where I slapped documents on a table while Gerald sputtered. Real things don't happen that way usually. What happened was paperwork, phone calls, a certified letter drafted by Helen and sent to Gerald at the restaurant's registered address, informing him that the purported termination of Nora's employment was not authorized under the terms of the LLC operating agreement and was therefore void. The letter also noted, in careful legal language, that any attempt to bar Nora from the business premises or to interfere with her ability to perform her duties would constitute a breach, and that the sending party reserved all available remedies. Gerald called me the evening the letter arrived. I know it was the evening the letter arrived because Helen had told me to expect a call that day. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was 3 minutes long and started with, "I think there's been a misunderstanding," and ended somewhere around, "We're family, and I don't want this to get complicated." I saved the voicemail. He called again the next morning. I answered that one. "Ruthann," he said. "That's my name. Ruthann. I think we need to sit down and talk about this like reasonable people." "I think that's a good idea," I said. "Have your attorney contact Helen Marsh at Marsh & Associates. She'll set up the meeting." A pause. "You've already lawyered up." "I've engaged counsel on behalf of my daughter, yes." Another pause, longer. I could hear him breathing. "This isn't what I intended," he said. "Eliminating Nora's position. It was a business decision. It wasn't personal." I let that sit for a moment before I answered. "Gerald, I said, "Your son changed the locks on his wife and their 18-month-old daughter and sent a 3-word text. And the following morning you called her at 5:30 a.m. to tell her she no longer had a job." I kept my voice even. "I understand you may not have intended it to be personal, but I want you to hear me when I say I am going to make sure my daughter is protected, and I am prepared to be very thorough about that." He didn't say anything. "Have your attorney call Helen," I said, and I hung up. The legal process, if you are imagining it, is slower than you want it to be and faster than the other side expects. Helen filed a formal demand on behalf of Nora for reinstatement and back pay for the days she had been improperly excluded from her position. She also filed separately a notice to the LLC's secondary member, the woman I mentioned, who had never formally exited, informing her that her interest might be subject to a dispute and that she might wish to be represented. That letter, Helen told me later, was what changed the temperature of everything. The secondary member, I'll call her Frances, had assumed for years that her interest had been quietly resolved. It had not. When she received Helen's letter, she retained her own attorney. And when her attorney started looking at the operating agreement and the history of distributions, they found that Frances had not received a distribution from the LLC in over 6 years, despite the restaurants having been profitable. Gerald, it turned out, had a problem that had nothing to do with Nora. And now it was visible. I want to say something about Brandon, because it would be easy to make him simply a villain in this, and I don't think the truth is quite that simple. Brandon is a weak man. That's different from a bad one, though the outcomes can look the same from the outside. He had spent his whole life watching his father perform authority and had learned to perform it himself without the substance underneath. He had married a woman who was genuinely competent and had, I think, spent several years feeling quietly threatened by that and had never once said so out loud. Instead, he had let things build and then had done the cruelest, most cowardly thing available to him, which was to lock her out in the middle of the night without a conversation. I don't forgive that. I want to be clear about that. But I understand it in the way you can understand something without accepting it. Nora filed for divorce 6 weeks after the morning in the parking structure. She had a good attorney. Helen referred her to a colleague who specialized in family law, and because Arizona is a community property state, the marital assets were divided in a way that left her with enough to start over properly. Brandon didn't fight it. I think, by the end, he was relieved. The restaurant situation resolved over the course of about 4 months. Gerald, faced with Frances's claims and the formal demand on Nora's behalf, chose to negotiate rather than litigate. The settlement involved a buyout of Frances's interest at fair market value, a revised operating agreement, and a payment to Nora that covered her back pay, plus a separation package that Gerald's attorney had initially laughed at and then, after seeing Helen's documentation, had stopped laughing at. Nora did not go back to work at the restaurant. She didn't want to, and there was no reason she should have to. What she did with part of the settlement was take the accounting courses she'd been putting off for years. She had always been good with numbers, but had never formalized it. She passed her CPA exam on the first attempt, 9 months after that morning in the parking structure. I was there when she got the results on her phone. She showed me the screen, and I said, "Of course you did," and she laughed, really laughed for the first time in a long time. Lily is 3 now. She has her mother's dark eyes and, apparently, my stubbornness, which Nora says is not a compliment, and which I take as one anyway. She calls me Grandma Ruth and says it with great seriousness, like it's a formal title, which I suppose it is. We have dinner every Sunday, the 3 of us, at my house in Scottsdale. Nora brings something, salad or bread or a bottle of wine she started learning about, and I cook, and Lily sits at the kitchen island on her little stool and narrates everything I do as though she's a cooking show host in training. After dinner, when the dishes are done and Lily is winding down, we sometimes sit on the back porch and talk. Real talking, not small talk. About Nora's work, about what she's building, about what she wants the next 10 years to look like. She's sharp and she's focused and she's not angry anymore. Not the tight, clenched anger of that first year. Something softer has replaced it. Something that looks a lot like confidence. Last Sunday, she asked me, out of nowhere, why I had kept that folder for so long without telling her. I thought about it. Because I didn't want you to see Brandon through my eyes, I said. You were happy. I thought I might be wrong. I hoped I was. I looked out at the yard, and I thought that if I ever wasn't wrong, it would be better for you to have someone standing behind you with solid footing than to have known all along and spent your marriage waiting for something to fall. She was quiet for a moment. Were you scared? She said. When you were doing all of it? The legal stuff, Gerald's call, all of it? I thought about that too. No, I said. And then, because she knows me, I was focused. Scared is when you don't know what you're doing. I knew what I was doing. She nodded slowly. I want to be like that, she said. When Lily's older, I want to be the person who already has the folder. I reached over and put my hand over hers. You already are, I said. You just didn't know it yet. The sprinklers in the front yard came on a few weeks ago, at the same time I was standing at the kitchen window with my coffee, and I had a sudden, complete memory of that morning. The way the light was, the way my phone felt in my hand when I saw her name, the weight of knowing what was coming and choosing to be ready for it. I am 63 years old, and I have buried a husband and raised a daughter and worked for 22 years reading the fine print that other people didn't bother to read. I have kept files and made calls and sat on concrete parking garage floors when that was what was needed. None of it was remarkable, really. It was just paying attention. It was just loving someone enough to be prepared. The sprinklers turned off. I finished my coffee. Lily was coming with Nora for Sunday dinner in a few hours, and I had things to do. I rinsed my cup and got started. I've been thinking about what actually happened, not the legal part, not the paperwork, but the deeper thing underneath all of it. Gerald spent years presenting himself as something he wasn't. Brandon spent years watching him do it and learning the performance without the substance. And somewhere in that long imitation, they both made the same miscalculation. They assumed that the people around them weren't paying attention. That's the thing about quiet people, the ones who don't announce themselves, the ones who sit at a barbecue and ask a polite question about lease structures and then smile and change the subject. People like Gerald and Brandon tend to mistake that quietness for weakness. They see a woman who doesn't argue and assume she has nothing to argue with. They see patience and read it as passivity. They build their confidence on that misreading, and they keep building, and eventually they do something like change a lock at midnight and call at 5:30 in the morning with the words, effective immediately, because they've convinced themselves that no one is prepared for them. Nora was not prepared. She was 27 when she married Brandon, and she trusted the picture he presented to her because she loved him and because she hadn't yet learned that love and discernment have to operate together, not in separate rooms. I don't fault her for that. I made my own versions of that mistake when I was her age. What I do believe is that our choices compound over time. The shortcuts we take, the questions we don't ask, the documents we don't read, they compound quietly, and then one day the total comes due. Brandon's choice to lock out his wife and daughter didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the sum of 1,000 smaller choices to avoid honesty, to perform authority instead of earning it, to let resentment grow in silence rather than speak it out loud. Gerald's choice to call Nora at 5:30 was the sum of years of letting someone else's signature carry his name while he stood in front of it and took the credit. Neither of them set out to be the kind of men they became that morning. They just never chose to be anything different. I kept that manila folder for 9 years. Not out of suspicion exactly. More out of a conviction I've carried since my years in commercial real estate that the people you love deserve someone in their corner who has read the fine print. Ruth Ann the paralegal, Ruth Ann the mother, those two things turned out to be the same thing. What I want Nora to carry forward, what I hope Lily grows up seeing just by watching her mother move through the world, is this: intelligence without integrity is just cleverness and it runs out. But when you combine real knowledge with the genuine intention to use it well, when you build something slow and solid and honest that holds. That's what Nora is doing now, studying for her CPA, building her own name on things she actually understands, not performing ownership, actually owning. I rinsed my coffee cup that morning and got started. That's all it ever is, really. You know what you know. You love who you love. And then you get started.